The standard Japanese fantasy setting, as it is named by tvtropes.com, has become iconic across the world. Animes like Konosuba, Frieren, Delicious in Dungeon, which just had a major release, and many more. We know the tropes. It has experience points, skills, classes, a demon king threatening the world, and adventurers delving into dungeons for loot. As fans of fantasy tabletop role-playing games, this should sound very familiar. However, coincidence, or more accurately, slothful induction, is a fallacy. Let's take a look at the origins of the standard Japanese fantasy setting and where it got its initial inspirations. Howdy folks, my name is Sean and welcome back to Delver. If you have spent any time playing Dungeons & Dragons, the world's most popular fantasy role-playing game, first developed in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson of TSR, you will notice a lot of similarities in its core gameplay and fantasy anime and manga. Now, it's not just the existence of these tropes that makes it so apparent. It is how openly these systems are represented in the world of the animes and mangas we're going to discuss. Experience points are a tool used in D&D to figure out what level your character is, but often it's just a game mechanic and it's behind the scenes, and it's not really used in the world at large. However, this is not the case in a lot of Japanese high fantasy.
Which brings us to your registration card.
Experience, or XP, is an actual number that is known by the heroes in the story, and it's often tied to a skill card, or character sheet, that is a part of a local adventuring guild or some other governing entity.
When your level increases, you'll earn points you can trade in to learn new skills.
And just a little side tangent, something that I find interesting, the reason that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson went with XP to represent experience points is because they already had an acronym in the game, EP, which was Electrum, which is everybody's least favorite form of currency in D&D. A lot of these animes are gamified, meaning that the mechanics are a part of the world. This is fairly unique to Japanese fantasy, and there are some very interesting reasons for it existing in this way. In the 1980s, fantasy games became very popular in Japan. Fantasy literature, however, had a harder time landing in this overseas market. Outside of the dedicated fan base to fantasy, the genre was mostly propped up by imported and translated editions of The Lord of the Rings and, much later, Harry Potter. Translation errors were abundant, and a lot of the charm and feeling behind these stories were vastly diminished. Now, that's not to say that Japan has not had a lot of fantasy since then. The novels like The 12 Kingdoms by Fuyumi Ono and Brave Story by Miyuki Miyabe have their own massive followings. In the late 20th century, however, the two mediums that were the most engaging for young fantasy fans were video games and, of course, tabletop role-playing games.
Dungeons and Dragons.
The interactive nature of these mediums made fantasy much more enjoyable to these fans. They were no longer taking the back seat in the story and were making their own tales that felt more natural, adding back a lot of the lost charm from mistranslated fantasy novels. When you consider that this was the environment where a lot of budding fantasy hobbyists, including manga and anime creators, got their start, then it's no surprise that you see a lot of these core mechanics showing up in their works. A wide cast of characters in a party, levels and experience points, and classes with special abilities. A lot of this early inspiration came directly from Gary Gygax's design of D&D, and later editions had a lessened impact on the hobby. Other games like RuneQuest and Tunnels and Trolls were also major inspirations for the genre. Despite its growth, the community was fairly small at this time, however. That all changed in September of 1986 when Comtique magazine began publishing replays, direct transcripts of a role-playing game session. These transcripts allowed people who were interested to get a taste of the stories and the characters and the worlds without really having to learn the rules or play the game. Honestly, it's a lot like how Critical Role got a lot of the early 5e audience invested in the mid-2010s. Record of Lodoss War became the trope codifier of this style of writing, meaning that it wasn't the first to do it, but it was the most popular. It was a fantasy replay series written by Ryo Mizuno and featured his rules-free setting of Forcellia. The replays became widely popular, leading to a 3-volume series released between November 1989 and July 1991. The series followed a group of roguish adventurers as they traveled across the island of Lotus. It became one of Japan's first domestic high fantasy literature series in 1988, and this coincided with the release of Dragon Quest. To date, the series has around 32 novelizations, 8 TTRPGs, and 53 episodes of an anime with an additional 3-part film. You can find The Record of Lotus War on Crunchyroll, but the dub, and honestly sometimes the sub, are not the best quality. It's plagued by a lot of that early 90s high-pitched shrieking and annoying voices, and of course, overacting galore.
Same old story, kid. Bad luck.
Still, the animation and overall story are really awesome, and it gives a great look at how early D&D was seen by its audience.
Oh, yeah. I owe you my thanks.
During the time of the novelizations, TSR being TSR, they quickly swooped in as the series grew in popularity and requested that Mizuno not infringe on their intellectual property. And TSR being TSR, this was the wrong call. This prompted Group SNE, the company that was responsible for translating a majority of the Western tabletop games into Japanese, to create their own system called Sword World RPG. This new domestic RPG took a lot of the audience away from D&D, and it inspired a lot of creators in Japan to try their own hands at making games and stories. And just as a side note, the game Call of Cthulhu is actually one of the most popular games in Japan in 2025. Just a fun little fact, I thought you'd like it. Imagine if Hayao Miyazaki decided one day he was going to remake Skies of Arcadia. Now, that's exactly what you get by checking out today's sponsor, The Wandering Tavern. The Wandering Tavern is a Studio Ghibli-inspired sourcebook featuring a floating tavern, lore guides, downtime activities, new monsters, and more. Using promo code DELVER at checkout, you get 30% off of your purchase. And I want to be clear, this is only possible because Homie and the Dude, the studio behind the project, allowed me to lower my own affiliate fee to ensure that you guys got even more savings. Thank you to Homie and the Dude for sponsoring today's video. Now look, Japan already had their own robust yokai and historical fantasy genre, and that meant that Western literature had to compete against it to really make a mark. Fantasy gaming had the unique opportunity to inspire Japanese creators with something interactive rather than passive when introducing them to Western fantasy. Growing up playing Sword World RPG, Castlevania, D&D, and Dragon Quest had a massive impact on these creators, and the idea of what fantasy was became heavily associated with the core mechanics and tropes of playing these games. Classes, skills, levels, these were integral parts of understanding fantasy stories of the late 20th century in Japan, so they became synonymous with what fantasy was.
Why do they keep letting noobs down here?
Tropes like the Demon King, however, existed well before TTRPGs, and I've actually learned from Yo Frank, the amazing historian who helped me research this topic, that the term comes from the word Mao, I hope I pronounced that right, a word coming from the devil-like figure in Buddhism. This entity, named Hajun or Papyrus in Japanese and Sanskrit respectively, had the proper title of the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. Furthermore, the term Demon King is heavily associated with Nobunaga Oda, the famous warlord who nearly united Japan during the Warring States period. While not an exact retelling as well, the FX series Shogun covers this period, and honestly, it's one of my favorite shows. I highly recommend going and watching it. The kanji used for demon is heavily related to the Japanese for magic, and it's most likely this is where the translation to Demon King came from when speaking of a high-powered magic user who takes over the world.
Slaying the Demon King was one chapter, but read on. For we've stories yet to tell and lives yet to live.
Now, there are no doubt countless origins for the formation of the standard Japanese fantasy setting and high fantasy in Japan, but the impact of tabletop games was massive. D&D is not as popular in Japan as of 2025, but the domestic production of stories and other games spawning from its early inspiration has been incredibly important. In fact, Ryoko Kui, the creator of Delicious in Dungeon, admitted he was not even aware of D&D when he made the series, and I would argue personally that that is one of the most classic D&D campaigns ever. that honestly really just goes to show you how pervasive the influence of D&D is on the genre in Japan in total. That's all I got for you guys today. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.